A young man falls to his knees in a sea of crimson as the stench of a gory battlefield flows throughout the air. The boy had romanticized the concept of knighthood. How could someone so young truly understand the reality of war? The grim sight of blood, wounds, agony, hatred, violence, and corpses is one that can only be understood via first-hand experience. But first-hand experience is not something these young men should have to live through. The battle this boy entered was known as the Demi-Human Civil War, a conflict rooted in Lugunica's foul treatment of the non-human. It would come to be known as a conflict unrivaled in the kingdom's history for the sheer amount of bloodshed. It started only 2 years prior to this very moment. A fragile peace was broken by the collision of demi-human merchants and human border guards as they attempted to cross into the Empire of Wallachia, and they were suspected of espionage. Their deaths at the hands of humans had inspired a revolt. The boy's name was Grimfausen, and all he could currently think to do in a maelstrom of war was drag his helpless, limp body through a nearly palpable cloud of death. As he drags himself along, he clings onto the sword he never got to swing, and desires nothing but to let go of the steel holding him to this war. But to give up one's sword was to give up one's life. The concept of never abandoning your blade is something highly tied to the concept of masculinity, especially within ReZero, something we see much older Wilhelm refuse to do as he searches endlessly for the white whale, and something Krush does in EX1 as she embraces a masculine identity. To reject this identity would mean to be rejected, as Grim clawed his way around under the crimson sky, until a violet-skinned demi-human stumbles upon the boy retreating from the battle. Grim stares death in the face, as a hatchet comes towards him. However, before it could cleave off his head, he was saved by an even younger boy with brown hair, completely eviscerating the demi-human threatening Grim's life. After the shock of the situation wears off, he gets up to thank the boy, but when he looks back, his eyes hold no emotion at all. They are nothing but empty blue voids staring back at Grim. Grim met the horrors of war and fled, but this boy faces it head-on, slaughtering hundreds of demi-humans, as Grim can do nothing but watch. The boy stops and looks towards the sky and says, "So this is what battle is like. I didn't know." The battle on that day was won solely by that child, who called it trivial, a spit in the face to what the average soldier feels, building that dichotomy between your average soldier and this boy, Wilhelm Trias. Grim only learns his name through another soldier he became close with, Thulter Weasley. As they speculate about him, a full knight of the Royal Army calls the squadron to attention, introducing their brand new member, Wilhelm Trias. The group talks about how war has given them an opportunity to live beyond their means, to live a fulfilling life more than just peasants. Even heroes deserve free time, right? Like people like Rita Straya, who regularly engaged in women and booze. Wilhelm finds this to be a stupid concept, dedicating his time to building his skill and training at such a young age, as Wilhelm leaves the room. Grim and Thulter continue to drink, until Grim starts heading towards his room, finding Wilhelm training at night behind the barracks. Wilhelm does remember his name, and this surprises Grim, but Wilhelm tells him it doesn't really mean anything. It's just easier to remember names before mocking Grim for getting drunk, saying that practicing the sword is more likely to keep him alive than drinking and sex. Grim refutes the idea that everyone lives life purely for the sword, and some people end up turning to things like wine and sex for a little comfort, to which Wilhelm replies that Grim is better than him at one thing, making excuses for his inadequacy. The next morning, the squadron is thrust into another clash with the demi-humans. Grim, in stark contrast to young Wilhelm, could not bring himself to swing his blade and take another person's life, acting only in defense of himself and his allies utilizing his shield. The Royal Army is laying waste to the demi-humans this go-around, and something doesn't feel right to Grim. It's as if the hairs are standing up on the back of his neck. Something's not right. Immediately after his near premonition, it's revealed that the demi-humans have laid down magic circles, as soldiers begin to catch fire and a mass retreat begins, leading to other soldiers being trampled to death. Wilhelm, on the other hand, demands the army advances forward, and that retreat is playing exactly into the demi-human commander, Valga Cromwell's, wishes. Wilhelm and the commander end up butting heads, and Wilhelm tells them to just accept their deaths as he pushes onwards, and Grim runs after him. He ends up running right into a magic circle while it's still in its preparation stages, and kicks the circle apart, deactivating the ritual. Wilhelm proceeds to slaughter the demi-humans left and right as Grim watches, not in admiration, but in something like horror, noticing the demonic smile across Wilhelm's young face. Grim mutters to himself, referring to Wilhelm as a devil. He's frozen. Behind him lies the sword devil creating rivers of blood, and in front of him, his friends he abandoned scream in agony, as the Royal Army ends up shattered. The army of Lugunica faces the defeat of the battle for Castor Field, as thousands of lives are lost, including Grim's previously mentioned friend, Thulter. The great demi-human strategist Valga Cromwell was present at the battle, heavily contributing to the human defeat. Immediately after the crushing battle, Wilhelm walks away from the medical center but is stopped by 2 knights. He is initially bothered by them, stating that 1 day of mistraining takes 3 to make up, as the 2 of them are amazed at his accomplishments at such a young age. The knights are Bordeaux and a man named Pivot, and Wilhelm challenges them both to a fight after they continually pester him. They gleefully accept, and Wilhelm manages to beat a knight, seemingly twice his size, to get a 7-3 record. This doesn't bother Bordeaux, however. It pleases him indeed, as they didn't come to fight for no reason, but to recruit Wilhelm to Bordeaux's squadron. Grimm, being one of the only survivors of Wilhelm's previous squadron, is also brought into Bordeaux's squad during a mass reorganization of the army after the defeat at Castor Field. Wilhelm becomes the talk of the squad after his bouts with Bordeaux, and Wilhelm states that he goes into battle not to kill, but to experience true swordsmanship, as you can only ever truly use the sword in life or death combat. As they chat, a new mission pops up. A return to Castor Field with the mission of escorting a VIP to the field. As humans are naturally worse than demi-humans at magic, they are escorting someone adept at magic to the field to inspect the magic circles that were crucial to human defeat. Returning to this field sends a shiver down Grimm's spine. They haven't even arrived yet, but the grim reminder of the sheer loss he saw that day, the loss of his friends, the crushing of the royal army, is enough to make any man's heart start to pump faster and faster, besides Wilhelm, who considers Grimm a coward. The carriage they're in tells Wilhelm to chill out on Grimm. As they arrive with the VIP, Roswell J. Mathers, Wilhelm is not fond of the way Roswell carries herself, building his misogyny points by the minute. She also has a personal attendant, Carol Remendez. Wilhelm is shocked that both these supposedly powerful people are women, and Carol immediately points out his muttering to the crowd. Wilhelm tells Carol to stop whining, and Grimm cuts in, telling him to stop being an asshole and causing problems for no reason. He replies with a half-assed apology as Bordeaux splits the squad into 3 groups, 1 to protect Roswell, and 2 to set up a perimeter. Roswell asks Bordeaux for Wilhelm specifically to accompany her, confusing pretty much everyone. As they go towards the circles, Roswell points out how Wilhelm feels nothing about returning to a battlefield that once hosted rivers of blood. As Grimm engages Carol in conversation so that she doesn't talk to Wilhelm, Roswell investigates the circles, stating them to be incredibly dangerous. Not just the circles themselves, but the concept of them being placed by such a skilled magic user. Something begins to poke and prod at Grimm's senses again. Something is off at Castor Field once more. Wilhelm tells Grimm to shut up, as a stray arrow flies directly towards Roswell, which Wilhelm slices, preventing it from hitting her. Grimm looks to where the arrow came from, and it's Thulter? But it's not him. It's a mere puppet of him, the shambling corpse of his friend, a mockery of death. Wilhelm asks Roswell if this is magic, and she replies yes and no. It's more like a curse, as corpses begin to claw their way out of the earth, dredging back the events of this horrific battle just days before their return. Wilhelm charges through the corpses, noticing a girl in a white robe amidst the dead, and almost gets burned by fire magic blasting directly towards him to stop his progression. A Ryuzu Mayor clone stands in the battlefield, and Wilhelm calls her a monster, to which the small pink-haired girl says she has a way to go before she's like her mother. Roswell steps in, infuriated that she wants to be like her honored teacher, claiming that she will destroy her utterly and entirely. The clone says that she had retrieved what she had came to the field to get and attempts to flee, as Wilhelm chases after her before getting stopped by hordes of undead. Roswell says the more undead that are killed, the stronger the remainders become. However, there should be one core zombie that acts as a control point for the rest. Wilhelm notices that Thulter is different from the rest, and while battling undead, yells at Grimm to chop his head off. Grimm comes to a halt. He can't possibly kill the one person he became so close to in this hellish environment, and Wilhelm says that that isn't his friend. It's his corpse that has become lost. If he has the energy to complain, he has the energy to kill it. Grimm responds saying that he's scared. So unbelievably scared, and experiences survivor's guilt after the battle, stating how he can't stand that everyone died but he, the coward, had lived, causing him to dash to Thulter, shouting he doesn't want to die. Grimm demands that he is going to live, decapitating the mockery of his dead friend. The second battle of Castor Field is won, and the squadron didn't lose a single person. Roswell says the person controlling the dead and who laid the circles goes by the name of Sphinx, the witch's legacy. The news that the Demi-Human Alliance was openly working with the witch known as Sphinx was a shock even to the administrators of Lugunica. They speculate amongst themselves, initially stating perhaps she works with the witch cult as well, before shooting down the idea and asserting she only works for herself. Bordeaux's squadron is called to give their testimony of the battlefield, and Grimm and Wilhelm are bombarded by questions from the administrators. A man's voice cuts through the noise, asking what they thought of Sphinx, the man being Miklatov. Wilhelm tells him that she wasn't even human, and with people like Sphinx, it's kill or be killed. After the the meeting with the admins, the squadron is very confused by Wilhelm's conduct, not just in front of Lugunica's top minds, but also just in general, especially because Wilhelm is formally educated. They reference his lineage from the Trias family, a line of previous nobles that have fallen from grace over the years. Roswell enters the room and asserts that surely Wilhelm didn't plan to hide his lineage forever. Wilhelm becomes irritated with Roswell's presence once again, biting back about how Roswell clearly has some history with Sphinx, and she teases him about inquiring about her past, before assuring the squadron they do not work together. They speak about the state of the war in Sphinx, and Roswell mentions how the Sword Saint Freibel was recently killed during battle in an extremely selfless fashion. He sacrificed himself to save his allies, and with that lore drop, Roswell exits the room, and Pivot pulls Bordeaux aside, requesting him not to get too close to the mage or let his guard down around her, suspecting Roswell J. Mathers is hiding something behind the smile she shows them. We cut to a region in the southeast of Lugunica, Shamrock Valley. The valley is foggy day and night, something that is considered a bad omen in just about every part of this world. Due to its thick fog, it became the perfect place for those who worked in the shadows to hide. We hear yelling between the top members of the Demi-Human Alliance, Libre and Valga. Libre is infuriated by the use of not only the magic circles, but also the desecration of the dead. These two factors are massive optic losses for the demi-humans, according to Libre. How can they expect the humans to even consider terms of peace when they operate in this fashion? Sphinx cuts into their arguing, saying they are simply using the undead to shore up their numbers. Libre retorts that he would have expected this kind of behavior from a witch, but not from his trusted advisor Valga, who responds that he is using the corpses of immoral filth, and the souls of fallen demi-humans cheer him to do so. Libre tells Valga that this path will lead him to hell, and Valga tells him he is already there before they go their separate ways. And we jump forward 3 years into the future. Wilhelm has earned his own accommodations due to his record in battle and his reputation as the Sword Devil. He leaves his room sort of aimlessly, as Bordeaux and Pivot had forced Wilhelm to accept a day off after years of tireless training and work. He enters the capital city, a place that used to be bustling with life but has now come to a standstill. The Civil War's effect on the nation has been clear, and Lugunica was heading towards an awfully dark time after 5 years of constant warfare. The nation's rulers have attempted to contact the Divine Dragon in hopes of assistance, but it has refused to lend an ear to the cries of domestic affairs. Wilhelm heads to the slums to train by himself, where nobody would find him, because Wilhelm just likes to train alone, despising the idea of training against other people, as it goes against the essence of true swordsmanship for him. In sword battle, you fight the same person once, win or die, so training against others was a waste of time and resource to him. He trains against nobody but himself, feeling at peace until a woman with red hair apologizes for stumbling upon him. He tries to scout her to scare her off, but it just doesn't work. She asks him what's wrong. He replies asking why she is out here in these dangerous slums. He could be the danger. She, however, recognizes the uniform he wears. She asks to show him something. He denies, but she prods at him until he goes with her. What they come upon is a massive field of yellow flowers. She asks him if he likes flowers, and he tells her he can't stand them. Every time Wilhelm would return to these slums to train, she would be there as well. Every time he would finish practicing, she would ask the same question. That was until Bordeaux announces a new operation down south where Libre and Valga are allegedly present. Wilhelm scoffs, calling the plan foolish and that this is an obvious setup like last time. Lord Lip Bariel is present, somebody who has had quite a shady history in the kingdom and other stories. He tells Roswell he is taking over as commander after Lord Krumer was hit by a stray arrow recently and died, I guess. Lip does not like how Wilhelm carries himself, much like many people. However, Lip quite literally strikes out at Wilhelm for giving even a modicum of sass. Roswell manages to pull Lip away from the situation and defuse it, sparing Wilhelm more abuse. Grimm talks about a charm that Carol gave him for good luck in the upcoming battle, a charm that contained a yellow flower, the same flower with the girl in the poor district. Battle is about to take place amidst the Ihia swamp near the border of Wallachia, and the soldiers discuss fears of how Wallachia might react to the forces assembled on the border. They ponder if Wallachia will take advantage of Lugunica being spread so thin from the Civil War to make any moves. Wilhelm was confused by Grimm's character, someone who didn't want to die but kept rushing into battle alongside him. To him, he was a walking oxymoron. Grimm knows exactly what Wilhelm was thinking about him and asks Wilhelm if he wants to die, but before he can answer, he concludes no, probably not. He probably wants to live the most. They push towards the center of the battlefield, and Wilhelm notices a flower growing in the battlefield. Very potent war symbolism. You will see references to flowers in war in the currently ongoing Russian-Ukraine war, but it goes back even further than that. The red poppy flower has references dating back to the Napoleonic Wars, where flowers would grow around the bodies of fallen soldiers in an otherwise barren land. Poppies would become an image of hope for peace, with the unspoken message that sacrifice was noble for the greater good. This was especially prominent in the field of Flanders in late 1914, which would be written about in the poem In Flanders Fields in 1915. Funnily enough, this would not be the first reference to Flanders in ReZero, but Patrochet, Subaru's ground dragon, is named after the dog of the protagonist of the 1872 novel A Dog of Flanders. Lip Burial is confused by all of the magic circles being used in the battlefield, thinking the demi-humans are up to something, and Roswell corroborates this by saying the circles are unusual. At the same time, Wilhelm crosses blades with the demi-human commander Libre, who was outpacing Wilhelm using his 2 blades, pushing him into a defensive battle. Wilhelm, staring down the barrel of defeat for the first time, begins to laugh, louder and louder. This catches Libre off guard, and that second of an opening gives Wilhelm the chance to chop off one of Libre's hands. This seemed like a good moment for Wilhelm, but Libre simply regenerated the missing hand, punching Wilhelm so hard in the gut that he cracked his ribs as the unit surrounds Libre. Libre notices he is outnumbered and outmatched, activating a magic circle that makes them all feel like they're underwater. Ultimately, it adds tons of weight to their physical burdens. Roswell and Carol are also affected, as Sphinx descends down to them. Sphinx wants Roswell to help complete her, and slaughters the surrounding soldiers in hopes to make Roswell crack. When Roswell refuses, she shoots a light straight down at her that Carol can only witness. Libre demands peace, to not be mercilessly picked out and murdered and trodden underfoot. The demi-humans just want to live. He doesn't want to kill immobilized knights, but knows that doing so will break the will of humanity. But before he can do anything, Wilhelm overcomes the burden to save Bordeaux, to which Libre commends his loyalty. Libre advances and Wilhelm is still under too much weight, and when Libre is about to pierce the young man, Pivot jumps in and takes the blade for Wilhelm, screaming to not let him die. The other members of the squadron fight the effects of the spell to confront Libre and protect Wilhelm. He yells, pleads with them to stop putting their lives on the line for someone who wouldn't do the same. He faces danger again and again, but every single time, somebody saves his life once more. Grim lasts longer than the rest of the soldiers, but ultimately gets stabbed in the throat. This causes a cyclone of rage to burst out of Wilhelm, as he tackles Libre and pushes him to the ground. At the other battlefield, Roswell had managed to dodge the light fired by Sphinx even though it moved faster than the eye could see, and punches Sphinx in the abdomen, ravaging her insides. Roswell is not as affected by the magic circles as one would expect, because the more adept you are at magic, the more your mana cycles line up with the spell, and Roswell J. Mathers is not capable of using magic, as she puts on 2 steel gauntlets. Sphinx attempts to dodge, as every single one of Roswell's punches seems strong enough to break a boulder, until a kick that could split a tree hits her, and she barely manages to fly into the sky where Roswell can't reach her. As she flees, Roswell destroys the magic circle, burdening the army, as Wilhelm struggles with Libre on the ground, and Libre remarks that he might just have feelings after all. Pivot dies in Bordeaux's arms, but is immediately resurrected as an undead that throttles Bordeaux, barely being saved by Grimm. As Wilhelm and Libre tussle, we see the dichotomy of human and demi-human. Throughout this entire book, the humans are depicted as people going on a massacre, with Wilhelm, a literal sword devil or demon, as the protagonist, and people like Libre, who act with honor on the battlefield and preach about simply wanting to live normal lives. As Wilhelm faces defeat yet again, Libre feels bad for the boy. Such intense vitality did not deserve this fate, until Sphinx kills Libre to immediately turn him into a puppet to protect her. He initially refuses to become her puppet and fights back, only to get further annihilated by Sphinx to the point of succumbing to her will. Sphinx flees, refusing to fight the heavily injured Wilhelm, but takes great interest in the vessel of anger that supersedes death. The Battle of Ahia Swamp went down as the worst defeat since Castor Field, and blame was placed on the shoulders of the commander, Lip Burial, who was marred as a war criminal due to playing right into the demi-human's trap. When he attempted to fight back, his counter-lawsuit was denied. Bordeaux was radicalized further into his intense hatred for those not human. Grimm had permanently lost his voice, and Wilhelm began to question his way of living as perfected steel. A month passes after this battle, and there have been no real major skirmishes to note. Wilhelm, who has had no battles to fight, begins to sulk into depression and anger. Wilhelm has resorted to training his life away, constantly thinking about the words he exchanged with Libre. Bordeaux is trying his best to fill the shoes Pivot had left, changing his manner of speaking and attempting to tackle things more logically, as if Pivot were still whispering in his ear. The concept of the visual representation of masculinity, Bordeaux being honest and open with his feelings, is something that puts Wilhelm on edge, building his desire to avoid him even more than usual. Wilhelm had finally gotten the massive battle he desired, but it came at an immense cost. He is unsure of what to do with himself. Immense inner turmoil brewed within him, as he felt a desire to not fight just for the sword, but to fight for other people after Grimm got stabbed. Carol sits in Wilhelm's room, waiting, telling him Grimm wants to see him. However, he snarkily replies that he's impressed she could deliver a message from someone who can't talk, which pisses her off naturally. Grimm may forgive all of the humiliating things he says about him, but she will not allow Wilhelm to demean him. We cut to the demi-human leaders, as Sphinx is attempting to recreate the spell known as the Sacrament of the Immortal King, a spell of resurrection we see used in EX1 and Arc 5, so that she can bring back Libre, as Valga worries how he can carry the rest of this war alone. With Libre out of the picture, Valga vows to plunge this world into hell. Wilhelm was assigned to military police, as the army reorganized once again, and his name was spread far and wide, accompanied with death and blood. He meets with the red-haired girl again, and they finally exchange names. Wilhelm and Teresia. He didn't want to let her know that he was called the Sword Devil in case it reviled her, as she asks him the usual questions about flowers, but this time also asks why he wields the sword. He stops in his tracks, the question catching him off guard, because this is all he has. Wilhelm finally follows up on Grimm's invitation, meeting up with him and surprising him. Grimm cannot speak and only writes on paper to communicate, something that irritates Wilhelm. They talk about the state of Bordeaux's squad, and Wilhelm asks why Grimm put his life on the line to save him, and Grimm chuckles, as he never thought that his comrades' deaths would ever mean anything to Wilhelm, and Wilhelm never thought Grimm would be laughing about death. Grimm tells him that nobody blames him, and that he is the sword of the squadron. If he is still standing, so are they. They consider Wilhelm's way of living an ideal that the rest of them cannot reach, and up close they get to see exactly what makes him amazing. He wishes he could tell him this with his own voice, but he thanks Wilhelm. Thanks to him, he's here now. Teresia adds the question of why he wields the sword to her list of questions she asks every time they see each other. Wilhelm has started having a hard time facing his sword, associating it with a sense of anxiety, picking up the survivor's guilt Grimm had felt in his first battle and struggling with the feeling. As Teresia becomes the sense of calm the sword once brought him. Teresia says that if it brings him this much pain, just put the sword down. He tells her that would be unforgivable, which is an especially hurtful response knowing Teresia's backstory. She tells him that she hopes he could find a reason to live beyond the sword. As a critical moment in Lugunica's history looms, a mass uprising of demi-humans all throughout the kingdom engulfed the nation in fires of war. Wilhelm's intuition leads him to believe that the uprisings all around the country are a diversion, and they are drawing forces away from the capital so they can lay siege to it. Bordeaux agrees with this assessment after Grimm backs him up, and the squadron moves to the castle. Lip Beriel stands guard at the castle and stops Bordeaux, stating that this is a violation of their orders and is practically rebellion. Wilhelm steps in despite their history, and when Lip attempts to strike him again, Wilhelm dodges with ease. Roswell steps out and uses her higher rank to officially command Bordeaux's squadron to join the castle's defenses, much to Lip's dismay. Wilhelm, by virtue of stepping up, is showing that he is developing care. Thrusting yourself into such a position to defend the castle means something deep down has moved him. When he begins to think about the specifics of the demi-humans' plans, he opts to head to the chapel, specifically with Roswell, Grimm, and Carol, as Bordeaux rushes to the throne room and encounters the undead Libre. Wilhelm finds guards dead outside of the chapel, and deep down, something within his chest moves, seeing this tragic loss of life. Valga and Sphinx are inside, speaking about what demi-humans would pray for. They were able to get in by utilizing an old passage built before the time of the dragon, when demi-humans helped build the kingdom. Valga reveals that he has a plan. There is a magic circle drawn on his physical body, pulling out a box of bones and slamming them into his chest, reminiscent of Betelgeuse absorbing the sloth factor, as Valga's body grows and grows, attempting to bring back the giants of old. Valga swings his massive arm as everyone dodges except for Grimm, who soaks the entire attack for Carol. Sphinx attempts to flee as Roswell, Grimm, and Carol chase after her. Wilhelm decides to 1v1 Valga, and tells him that the strength of his ideals does not matter right here, right now. If he is strong, he will win. If he is weak, he will crush him. Roswell catches up to Sphinx, who kicks her to the ground. Sphinx, however, planned for this, trapping the party in one location, as she fires a light beam that gets absorbed by Roswell's single-use anti-magic cape. Carol engages Sphinx, boasting a sword technique of Mendez, who serves the Sword Saints, making her capable of reaching Sphinx in the air. Sphinx attempts to retaliate against Carol, but Carol is able to jump off thin air and dodge the light beams, cleaving Sphinx's arm off. She plummets from the air as Roswell closes the distance and punches her so hard you can hear bones break and organs rupture. They attempt to move in to crush her skull once and for all, but she rips her cloak off, revealing the same circle on her that Valga utilized. She casts All Zewald, the ultimate form of her death ray, that would surely slaughter everyone here. But Grimm meets the beam head-on with his great shield. Wilhelm's attacks are merely bouncing off of Valga's massive body, as he gets pummeled by the giant. He finds an opening in his sluggish attacks and pierces one of his eyes, and buries his sword into Valga's mouth as he gets struck across the chapel by a massive hit. In this very moment, Valga realizes the pain of battle, the suffering his fellow demi-humans endured while he sat in the shadows concocting schemes, referring to himself as self-important as his brothers died on the battlefield. This is a battle of two opposites. Wilhelm only cares for the dancing of steel, and Valga who stands only for ideals. Everyone has a reason for fighting, an ethos, faith, pride, dignity. Wilhelm is different right now, or so he thought. He in this fight is impure steel. This impurity is what leads to Wilhelm taking yet another blow. As he is about to face death, he thinks about the friends he's made and experiences he's had. He lives in the moment, not thinking about the impact of things, where Valga knows that even if he falls here, the hatred of the demi-humans will never stop burning. Cutting back, Sphinx was astonished as Grimm blocks Alzewald with a mere shield, and the beam ends up cutting through the throne room, bringing Bordeaux and Libre down to the chapel. Sphinx uses the increase in numbers to taunt the party, until her other arm flies off. Libre has betrayed Sphinx. The Bordeaux squadron rushes downstairs after Sphinx flees with Roswell closely behind, and they absorb an impact from Valga that would have surely killed Wilhelm. Valga says that even if he dies now, the demi-humans will continue on. And before he can continue on his monologue, Wilhelm interjects, telling him to shut up and focus on right now. Once again, the demi-humans are portrayed as people who are always forward-thinking, and humans as only killing machines. Wilhelm proves this further by coming into his element, cleaning out any and all impurities as he only focuses on the battle in front of him, removing Carol, Grimm, and Bordeaux from his mind. He reclaims his sword, carving up Valga until he cuts the bones that are being utilized to make the spell in his chest, returning him to normal form. Roswell chases Sphinx down, throwing steel balls at her that feel like individual sword strikes. She attempts to utilize another hidden passageway in the castle to escape, and when Roswell is about to catch up, encounters Lip Burial underground. He claims that he has finished off Sphinx, and when she asks to see the body, he tells her he burned the corpse, giving her a necklace from the spoils of war. But as Roswell leaves, Lip turns back with Sphinx's body wrapped in rags. Lip will do anything to reclaim his honor, even forsake his loyalty to the kingdom. The battle for the capital draws to quite a strange end. Wilhelm runs into Theresia again and feels joy. He feels accomplished at having protected her smile, and her saying his name makes his heart skip a beat. He equates himself to a piece of steel in a forge, and Theresia's heat has hit him and forged him into who he is today. It wasn't just Theresia though. It was Grimm, Bordeaux, Roswell, Carol, Pivot, and even Valga, Libre, and Sphinx. All of the people he had killed that forged the blade known as Wilhelm. She asks him if he hates flowers, and he replies, he doesn't hate them. She asks why he wields a sword, and he says it was the only way he could protect people. Valga was inevitably proven right, as the fall of Valga Cromwell led to mass demi-human revolts around the nation. I find it interesting how Wilhelm was forced to objectively view his true desire to battle with Valga, which was immediately torn down by Theresia's presence. Another battle comes, but Wilhelm actually saves rather than prioritizing fighting the enemy, and he returns to their special spot in the middle of the night. Theresia is planting new flowers for the new season, and it's a direct correlation to Wilhelm. EX1 and 2 both utilize flowers, but in different ways. EX1 uses flowers to initially represent the blooming of a relationship, then fragility and swift passage from life into death. EX2 uses flowers to represent the blooming of a new Wilhelm. The next morning, he drinks with Grimm, as they talk about his promotion to being a full-fledged knight. Wilhelm ribs him about Carol, and Grimm ribs him about an unknown girl that's clearly had an influence on him. They get to talking about what would quell the flames of war, and Grimm writes down a hero, someone like the Sword Saint. Wilhelm returns to his room to find Roswell propositioning him for like the 30th time because apparently she's never not horny. She informs Wilhelm that the fighting is about to reach the Trias lands, and he rushes to Bordeaux, who stops him in his tracks because he wants to logistically confirm the situation before an official knight of the kingdom goes to fight. So, Wilhelm returns to Theresia. Wilhelm tears off his dragon crest and leaves a note alongside of it saying sorry to Bordeaux, as he heads on a rogue mission to the lands of the Trias family. When he arrives at his old home, he finds the place he used to call home, the place that hosted his family, already wreathed in flames. He initially caught the demi-humans off guard, pulverizing the enemy, but as they realized he was alone, the tide of the battle changed against him. He tried to do what he did with Valga, and only focused on the fight, and once again, he paid the price as he began to lose the battle. As he was about to die, he thought of all of the friends and encounters he's had along the way, as he came to the conclusion that, unlike his previous statements, Wilhelm Trias does not want to die. Suddenly, with a flash of red streak, the demi-humans are vanquished. This must have been the work of a god of death. This moment of destruction would go down in history solely because it was the first battle of this generation's Sword Saint. He returns to meet with Theresia yet again, attempting to strike her with his blade, but she catches it with her 2 fingers. Wilhelm feels humiliated. She knocks him to the ground, telling him that she won't come here again, as he had officially given her a reason to wield the blade, to protect the people she cares about, as he screams at her ever shrinking back that he will steal that sword from her, no matter her blessing or station, telling her to not make light of the beauty of a steel blade. Carol had first met Theresia when she was 14, having been born at the house of Remendez, destined to serve the Estrella family. They meet face to face for the first time, and Carol is extremely nervous and doubting her own sword skill, having met the Sword Saint and all. Wanting to prove Theresia actually possesses the skill of a Sword Saint, she asks for a lesson about the blade, to which Theresia denies. Carol would grow bothered by Theresia's disregard for her status as Sword Saint, as she continued to decline every one of Carol's attempts at a lesson. In an attempt to prove Theresia is the Sword Saint, she concocted a plan to put her to the test. The plan, of course, fails miserably as Carol gets destroyed by Theresia, as she sobs over her body, asking if she's okay and profusely apologizing. Carol then learned of Tiresia's divine protection of the death god from Freebel, the previous sword saint, and it sank in exactly what she had Tiresia do, and why she rejected the blade. She grew happy with how Tiresia lived, being her trusted confidant and happy to see her thriving outside of the battlefield. That is, until the Demi-Human Civil War came. Tiresia's first battle was an utter failure, being unable to bring herself to hurt others and costing her brother's life. This failure of the Sword Saint was covered up by the kingdom, and Carol began filling the call for the Sword Saint in battles. Not that she thought herself capable, but to protect Tiresia's happiness. The Estrella family slowly lost more and more of its members, as all Tiresia could do is keel over and cry out how sorry she is for being incapable. Carol suggested that she get out more in an attempt to get away from her family, prodding her to join the war. So she started going out and planting flowers. She had been lying in the shadows as Tiresia planted flowers in the slums, and started eavesdropping on her meetings with Wilhelm, completely unhappy that it was the devil that had found her. As Wilhelm began to help Tiresia, she also noticed that Tiresia began to help Wilhelm, and alongside Grimm's impression of him, Carol began to think more highly of him. Carol informed Tiresia that Wilhelm had gone to a hopeless battle in the lands of Trias, spurring her into action to use her blade to protect others. She stands there as Tiresia cries, slaughtering the demi-humans around her. She had given in to the destiny she had long resisted, making Carol shoulder a heavy feeling of guilt for pushing her to give in, and feeling responsible for separating Wilhelm and Tiresia. She thanks Carol behind an inauthentic smile. The smile she didn't give when speaking with the Sword Devil. The Civil War had ended, and Tiresia van Austria would be the name to go down in legend. The name Austria is likely a reference to Greek mythology, the being known as, well, Astrea, the daughter of Astraeus and Eos, who would grow to be a goddess of justice, innocence, purity, and precision, a title that would prove to be unbefitting many of the Astrea household. 2 years had passed. The Sword Devil was gone, and in his place, the Sword Saint rose in infamy. Talks between Jonas Lugunica and Kragril, the king of Lugunica and the representative of the demi-human factions respectively, caused the war to end after 9 long years of conflict. Tiresia and Carol attended the celebration of the end of the war, as Roswell gives her a ceremonial blade. Roswell pressures Tiresia to take the sword, stating there are more important things in this world, and as that happens, a figure in a muddy brown overgarment bursts into the ceremony, as the man and Tiresia lock blades. Tiresia sheds tears, being one of the few people in the ceremony hall aware of what is occurring, whereas most of the crowd cannot even track the fight. The sword given to her by Roswell shatters, as Wilhelm tells her that he wins, and that she no longer has any reason to hold a sword. It's as if time freezes around them, as she mutters the same question, "Do you hate flowers?" He says he has learned he doesn't hate them. "Why do you wield a sword?" He says it is to protect her. Carol begins to cry as Tiresia's true smile finally comes out, feeling an overwhelming desire to shout out at how kind Tiresia is. Guards rush in to apprehend Wilhelm, and Tiresia asks him to tell her he loves her, but he responds that only when the moment is right, as he is taken in by the guards. EX2 is a pretty solid book, however unfortunately it also became hard to read at times due to Wilhelm's insufferable attitude for most of it. His constant tongue-clicking and rude behavior towards people made him extremely one-note, most of his interesting development being held off towards the end of the book. The people around him were far more interesting: Grimm, Carol, Roswell, Bordeaux, and so on and so forth. Wilhelm was just not a gripping protagonist in EX2, and the repetition of his behavior made a lot of EX2 a grating read for myself personally. There isn't much to pull from Wilhelm's character in terms of interesting analysis, besides maybe he has some screwed up internalized masculinity, as evidenced by his feelings towards Bordeaux, but that would really be about it. My side story ranking at this point would be EX1 and then EX2. Let's see where EX3 sits. Wilhelm sits in a musty, dark cell after his interruption of the war celebration. He is speaking with a man across from him who goes by the name Ulf Sixtongue. They sit in the prison tower, adjacent to the royal castle, a place where the most heinous of criminals were imprisoned. Ulf's crime? He fucked 6 different women. That was it. Wilhelm is released early due to Tiresia's wishes, who tells him he's lucky he wasn't executed due to the mercy of the King Jonas. They have a sweet reunion and embrace each other, letting the nasty scent of 2-year unwashed Wilhelm hit her nose. Wilhelm wanders around trying to think of what's next, stopping at a grave containing hundreds of the fallen from the Civil War, but more importantly to Wilhelm, it is where pivot may lie. He returns home to Tiresia's feast, realizing that this has been her home for 2 years, but it barely looks lived in at all, as if she had barely gotten to stay in her own house due to the war. The near-perfect state of the home only furthers his resolve to never let her hold the sword she doesn't wish for again, thinking that she deserves to live a comfortable life. Wilhelm heads out to go meet Miklatov about rejoining the royal army, who tells him that many people now recognize that he possesses the strength to unseat the Sword Saint, therefore his readmittance to the royal army may be readily achieved. While that is all possible, he doubts anyone will accept Tiresia's relinquishment of her title. He responds that she doesn't want the title of the Sword Saint, but he is told that that is immaterial. She will not lose her position, and will answer to the kingdom when the time comes. Wilhelm is unsure of how to solve this problem, being able only to think of his sword, so he returns to Six Tongue from the prison. Ulf tells him just that, to stop turning this into a problem where he can't utilize the sword. So Wilhelm returns to Theresia to tell him that he is being readmitted to the army, and asks her not to go to the castle at all tomorrow. She asks if he does go against his wishes, will he hate her? He only says that he'll be angry, because he could never say that he would hate her. The next morning, he marches into the castle and meets with Bordeaux, Carol, and Grimm, and King Gionis is also on the scene. Wilhelm's plan to turn this into a problem with the sword is this: to defeat all of the kingdom's most able warriors to demonstrate how much greater he is than the Sword Saint, so her position can be dissolved. Theresia is pacing back and forth in her home thinking about the pros and cons of breaking her promise, when suddenly Roswell comes in to tell her that she's here to butt in just one more time. Wilhelm is taking on 40 of the kingdom's finest knights at once, and is winning pretty steadily. It's not a complete stomp though, as Grimm's defense provides quite the difficult matchup. Eventually he defeats 39 of them, leaving just Bordeaux as they finally have another rematch just like when he was a kid in EX2. Wilhelm takes him out in just one blow, having proven his skill with the sword as Theresia arrives breaking the promise. She is kinda confused why he went through all this effort, as this was already solved when the war ended, as King Gionis had no intention of pulling apart a man and woman in love. Theresia informs him that the condition of her release is to marry Wilhelm, as Miklatov backs up her statement, saying that it would be awful to force a woman who's going to be a good wife and mother to wield the sword. This kingdom is so unbelievably fucking misogynistic. Wilhelm thinks about marriage and mutters to himself, Wilhelm Astrea, and Theresia corrects him, Wilhelm van Astrea, and the name Van being given to the lineage of sword saints by the person who first established it. Wilhelm didn't want to speak with a woman so badly and get this all cleared up that he instead challenged 40 elite Lugunica knights to a massive battle under the king's eye to get what he wanted. Wilhelm's patrol duty after this unfortunately gets doubled, because his wedding is just 3 days away. The wife-to-be shouts about how it's no coincidence that immediately after he was brought back into the military, his specific squadron gets chosen to increase patrols, blaming her father Veltal Astrea. Wilhelm can't necessarily deny it either. The timing is far too suspicious, and takes this as a challenge from Veltal. Bordeaux was recently promoted, meaning the squadron is now captainless, and on top of increased patrols, is now nominated to be captain. After Wilhelm and the squadron depart for the patrols, Theresia and Bordeaux confirm that Veltal was indeed responsible. Wilhelm confides in Grimm, stating that her father is attempting to sabotage the wedding, and everyone in the squad agrees that something is up, seeking to help Wilhelm make it through this patrol as quickly as possible so he can quickly make it home for the wedding on time. As they patrol the outskirts of the capital, Theresia and Carol meet up to give her mother and father a piece of their minds. Veltal is very adept at moving the goalposts and making it so Theresia can't get a word in until she cuts through the conversation to accuse her father of sabotage. Veltal admits he orchestrated the increased patrols, and the two begin to argue even louder than before. Tishua, her mother, even joins in on the prodding of Veltal. She cuts deep, stating that Veltal is acting possessive of his daughter, and will stop at nothing to keep her. Misogyny is the Astrea bread and butter. Veltal says he was attempting to test Wilhelm in some final masculine pissing contest, since Veltal is the last remaining man in the Astrea household after the deaths of Teresia's brothers in the Demi-Human Civil War. We cut from the family drama that seems surface level compared to what is to come to the Astreas. Grimm and Wilhelm arrive at Cordero Mountain near Kremlin, a town southeast of the capital. They were attempting to rescue some children from a cave known as the Lair of the Earth Snake, until an earthquake supposedly struck, burying the two of them in the cave alongside a child. The boy wakes up and informs them that the Earth Snake in the cave is what causes the earthquakes, and as they talk about it, the snake shows up. Grimm tries to find a way out as Wilhelm challenges the snake, and for some reason, the snake is stronger than almost any of Wilhelm's opponents. Grimm comes up with a plan to have the snake burst through the cave wall, freeing them from the darkness and letting the squadron slay the snake together. We cut to the day of the wedding, and the ceremony hall is already packed with attendees. Everyone is lying in wait for Wilhelm's squadron to hopefully arrive in time for the wedding, as Carol solidifies herself as a member of the LGBT community. Theresia is walked down the aisle by Veltal, as the aisle is being covered with flowers from the field where Theresia and Wilhelm had first met. Just in the nick of time, the squadron arrives, having no time to change or bathe. Once again, Wilhelm smells like shit. Flashing back to after the snake was defeated, the squadron tells him that defeating her helped them realize that the Sword Saint was just an ordinary person, a title that is something idolized, as evidenced by Reinhard finally being shed to see the person that lies underneath. A normal person with their own weaknesses. Theresia tells Wilhelm she loves him, and he doesn't at all reply as they kiss and officially get married. The wedding concludes and Veltol and Teresia argue again, this time because Veltol has been hanging around too much and desires to accompany them on their honeymoon. They leave this bum-ass behind and go with Carol. They were granted 2 months for their honeymoon thanks to the generosity of the king. Their first stop is down south in Flanders, where a variety of land dragons live, home to the dragon industry. Flanders is a name that further emphasizes the reference to the flowers as mentioned earlier in EX2, and furthers the interest in Patrichet for sure. Wilhelm and Teresia go to a ranch where they ride some earth dragons, and Teresia informs him of the species of the creature. There's the Flana species, which is the most numerous and versatile, the Elix species, which had adapted to the cold regions of the world, and then there's the Agarus types, which were suitable for desert environments, and finally, the Diana species, which have the most superior blood of all and is the kind of earth dragon Patrichet is. Wilhelm opens up about his family for the first time here in Flanders. His 2 older brothers were no good with the sword, but were smart and reliable, hence why they were given the domain. Wilhelm was often scolded by his oldest brother, always fought with his older brother, was lamented by his father for not carrying himself like a nobleman, and his mother would often hide his sword. But at the same time, his oldest brother still tried to be patient. His older brother would still rush to help him. His father instilled the customs of life into him, and his mother would often hug him when times got tough. After leaving Flanders, they head to Pictet, a city divided into 5 districts, one for each cardinal direction and a central district, the central district being where Wilhelm, Teresia, and Carol would be staying. Much to the dismay of Wilhelm, however, they do find Veltol here, because apparently this guy won't stop appearing on the fucking pages. He isn't here to just bother them apparently, but also to get Tishua a hair ornament for their anniversary. They all go together to a place called Suin Goods to meet with Yaktol, the person Veltol has been working with for years to get presents every anniversary, as well as being Otto's grandfather. Veltol and Teresia enter Suin Goods as Carol and Wilhelm go off to do something else, but something isn't right. They aren't alone, as somebody steps out of the shadows. A competitor to the ornament Veltol had specifically requested, as Veltol drops the annoying crying attitude he just had, radiating the authority of the head of the House of Estrella. The man who stands menacingly in the dark is called Stride Valakia, as Yaktol tells them that he had shown an interest in the item he had prepared. Yaktol attempted to refuse, but Stride insisted he meet with the person purchasing the ornament. Stride begins to turn his attention towards Teresia when suddenly a white handkerchief hits his chest and lands at his feet. Veltol had thrown it towards him, issuing a duel to the thin man. Teresia's divine protection allows her to judge a person's combat abilities, and her judgment informs us that Stride is not fit for any sort of battle. Stride affirms this suspicion, saying he is racked with illness and is incapable of fighting, and nominates a champion in his stead. Kurgan. As the behemoth steps into the shop, danger fills all of Teresia's senses. Not even she could suppress a shudder. Stride seemingly takes an interest in Teresia, but Kurgan interjects, informing him that this girl is no rabbit that you could catch. Stride continues regardless, remarking that she is more skilled than Veltol in the sword, and rebukes the king of Lugunica for allowing her to abandon her duty as the sword saint. Veltol realizes what this might do to the relations of the kingdom, and Stride taunts him, saying he can surrender if he wants the shame on his family. He turns back to Teresia and asks if she has no impulse to take up the sword for her dishonored father, and it seems the current sword saint wants for courage, or perhaps her husband is quite talented to keep a woman like her in bed. As soon as he finishes that sentence, Veltol punches Stride directly in the face, shouting he will not allow Stride to shame a man of the Estrellas. Wilhelm and Carol hear about the commotion in the center of town, and rush back to Veltol and Teresia, only to find blood and crowds surrounding it. They find Veltol injured and in the hospital. He's alive, but his gait has been seriously exhausted, as if he had been cursed. Yaktol arrives at the hospital, telling Wilhelm that Stride will be waiting for him at the Great Bridge, with the scarlet finger that is inflicting the curse afflicting Veltol. Wilhelm and Teresia both argue about who would go. Wilhelm wants to go because she should be abandoning the sword, and Teresia wants to go because she is still an Estrella and the Sword Saint, so she must clear away this disgrace. They come to an agreement, however, that they are both Estrellas and that they will go together. Wilhelm and Teresia arrive near the bridge, as Yaktol bestows a blade to Wilhelm, a sword chosen by Veltol himself that was meant to be another gift he was here to get. Upon Stride and Kurgan's arrival, Wilhelm demands he break the curse. When Stride obviously declines, another handkerchief hits his chest and falls to his feet, this time thrown by Teresia. She says she has no intention of turning this into a political incident worthy of the Empire of Valakia's time, and she will just steal the ring from him, before proceeding to mimic Stride from earlier, stating that she cannot fight, and nominates Wilhelm as her champion. Stride realizes who Wilhelm is nearly immediately, having assumed that the Sword Saint being defeated was simply a rumor not worthy of a second thought. Kurgan begins to laugh, remarking Wilhelm's warrior aura is dazzling, and how he has no doubt this one is fit to be an opponent for him. The conditions of the duel are this: If Wilhelm wins, they get the ring that is cursing Veltol. If Kurgan wins, he keeps Trias as his bride. People gather around the bridge to witness this duel, acting as sort of a ritual for Lugunica and serving as entertainment for the masses. Stride compliments Wilhelm's blade, stating it is quite nice but fails to hold a candle to the Yang sword. Kurgan and Wilhelm go back and forth for a while, standing at near equal skill. Wilhelm takes the battle, however, after welcoming a heavy hit from Kurgan, which gives him the opportunity to slice off one of his arms. Upon seeing this, Stride steps in, breaking the sacred vows of a duel in Lugunica. He takes off the ring that is cursing Veltol and accepts his loss, tossing it to Trias. As he is leaving, he looks back at Wilhelm to tell him not to worry. He still has 9 rings and 9 chances to play with him. As he exits the bridge, he also turns it to dust so they cannot pursue him. Wilhelm is given the ring and slices it in 2. Rings have a lot of different potential symbolism, but considering this is literally a story about Wilhelm and Trias' marriage, we can think of them as wedding rings. The symbolism of a wedding ring is tied to its shape, a circle, a shape used for concepts of totality, infinity, or timelessness. This will be important when talking about Stride in the future. They return to the hospital, and due to the effects of the curse, Veltol has completely lost the function of his right hand. It could have been worse, however, as the healer was focusing all of the decay from the spell onto one spot rather than affecting all of his limbs. EX3 ends with a sweet little recap of Grimm and Carol's relationship and the moment he fell in love with her, as well as giving us Grimm's reason for staying on the battlefield, to one day make Wilhelm happy who was there to save him. I was able to summarize the entirety of EX3 in just a few paragraphs, and to be quite honest, it was by far the least interesting ReZero book so far. I cut out a bunch of unnecessary fluff for the summary, including massively trimming down the cave incident. EX3 felt like Tape knew exactly what he wanted to do with it, but it would have been far too short to fill up a volume, so we added a bunch of frankly uninteresting content, like the unnecessary conflict with Veltol and the entirety of the cave, just for the payoff of the wedding to be half-baked and rushed. Characters in EX3 felt reduced to very one-note versions of themselves for comedic purposes and conflict purposes. Trias was emotional, Veltol was annoying, Carol was overprotective, and funnily enough, Wilhelm was the best among the cast of EX3. The final encounter with Stride and Kurgan hard carried this volume, but was only present at the very end. To kick off Battle Ballad, we get the immediate consequences of Wilhelm's encounter with Stride Wallachia, giving a report straight to the Council of Lugunica, including Miklatov. The council is entirely unfamiliar with a man named Stride, and is unsure of what his goals were with having the 2 strongest fighters of their respective nations challenge each other. They decide to send an official inquiry to the Empire of Wallachia to get information on Stride, but when Bordeaux gets the response, he is not too happy, and they do not acknowledge the request for info on Stride, and claim they don't even know where Kurgan is. Bordeaux sees this as an unofficial declaration of war, but ironically, Wilhelm tells him to cool his jets. They speculate what if the covenant with the dragon is no longer current, as the dragon did not move during the Civil War. However, it might not have acted because it was a civil war, and the dragon will only come to help with foreign threats. Speculation continues that due to the nation's weakness from the Civil War and the dragon seemingly acting dormant, Wallachia is getting brave and beginning to poke its nose into Lugunica's affairs. After speaking with Bordeaux, Wilhelm heads to a tavern to speak with Roswell about Stride. Roswell had attempted to pursue her connections about Stride, but was unable to come up with any worthwhile information. She gives him a light smirk, saying, "There is something more though," as the lights go out, and a kunai flies directly towards Wilhelm. He takes out the attackers with 0 issues. With Roswell not moving an inch, he attempts to let them surrender, but they take out their weapons to keep fighting. Wilhelm, Roswell, and the waiter in the tavern dispatch the rest. The waiter is Clind, the pedophile from the main series who serves Roswell. She kept 2 of the assassins alive to give details back to Wallachia, and 1 to interrogate about Stride. Clind notes that they are shinobi, skilled assassins that hail from the Kararagi city-states in the west. This is unsurprising given that in Arc 5 we learned Kararagi was formed essentially as a wannabe Japan. This encounter does not sit right with Roswell, however, who says that it's odd to send such low-skill assassins as soon as they search for Stride. Wilhelm leaves the tavern, as the reality of the situation sets in. The atmosphere around him feels wrong. He encounters Stride on his honeymoon, and now assassins are headed after him. He rushes back to his home and swings the door open, to find Stride standing in the hallway in front of him. They stand in the hallway facing each other until Stride cuts through the silence to rebuke Wilhelm for not giving him a kingdom's welcome. Wilhelm yells out, demanding to know where Trias is before a kunai flies at him from behind. Wilhelm noting it was more skillfully thrown than the tavern ones. The shinobi utilize a technique known as wall strike, where one manipulates the mana circulating inside of their body to boost one's control over said body. The shinobi gives Wilhelm some trouble, but he still manages to take them out. Stride laughs, concluding the fight with Kurgan wasn't just a fluke. He holds up his hand covered in rings, and says once all the preparations are in place, he shall give him the show of a lifetime. Wilhelm asks if he has cursed him, to which he responds that casting a curse on him now would be but middling entertainment. Wilhelm rushes towards Stride, but he uses one of his rings to move the dying shinobi by force. A pale blue seal rises up from their body, and Stride informs Wilhelm that a woman has been tied upstairs. Wilhelm finds Trias and Grimm, but they aren't tied up, just a little pale. Grimm dashes to her unconscious body, barely screaming out a part of her name through his scratchy voice. After 5 days, Carol still hadn't woken up. Wilhelm goes to meet with Bordeaux following the attack on the Austria house. Grimm is not taking it well. having sensed the danger from Stride but thinking it was targeting Teresia, leaving Carol completely exposed. Ulf, the guy from the prison in EX3, enters the room, having become an advisor to Bordeaux. He informs them that Stride regularly visits Shamrock Valley, the place the demi-humans used during the war, and where the witch had settled. We cut to a lizard man named Cragriel, a commander of the Demi-Human Alliance who represented it after it fell, holding a conversation with Roswell. Cragriel tells her to be careful around Shamrock, as only Valga and Libre were told how to enter it. Inside of Shamrock Valley lies what seems to be the testing grounds of Sphinx, and he adds that Libre entrusted the Alliance to him, giving Roswell a stone that contains a portion of Sphinx's ode, to remove the concealment mechanic of the testing grounds. Roswell returns with the good news, and the decision to mobilize the operation to Shamrock Valley was taken immediately. With Stride's movement discovered by Ulf and the witch's testing ground presumed to be Stride's objective, the squadron moves out to intercept. Before they leave, Teresia confides in Wilhelm, telling him she's afraid that this is a trap set by Stride. He agrees, but they have to try and stop him before it's too late. Teresia asks for Wilhelm's safety, but he knows that is something he cannot guarantee. Roswell and Wilhelm on the way to Shamrock Valley discuss the state of affairs, noticing the sulking Grimm in the rear. She remarks the massive burden he must be carrying, having unintentionally have Carol end up in the situation. As Wilhelm gets lost in thought, he doesn't say it, but he feels the same burden, having let Stride escape his grasp 2 times now. The stone is used to enter the witch's refuge, as Grimm leads the charge into the hideout. It feels as if Wilhelm gets lost in fog, slowly losing sight of all those around him, until a voice cuts through the fog, telling him he has gotten used to captaincy, as Pivot sits beside him. It had been 4 days since they set out for Shamrock Valley, as Teresia sits beside Carol's bed as she finally wakes up after 9 entire days. Before we get to celebrate her waking up for too long, we cut back to Wilhelm, who is alone besides Pivot, being completely lost in the fog, and quickly assumes none of this is really happening. Pivot continually attempts to get Wilhelm to stop moving around and talk about what is going on, but Wilhelm responds saying he is prioritizing the living. When the obstacle refuses to move, he reaches for his sword, and Pivot calls into question if he could really slay his friend. He flinches, looking down to realize he didn't actually pull the sword out, and his arm trembles, holding the grip of it, finally drawing it. Pivot asks what will he do now, and that this isn't like the sword demon, as he closes the gap in an instant, having Wilhelm parry solely on reflex. Pivot was a far worse swordsman than him, finding multiple gaps in his offense, but he couldn't bring himself to finish him off. Pivot notices this, prodding at him for being on the defensive in this battle. Wilhelm tries to land the finishing blow, and he begins to hear the blood-curdling scream from Pivot to not let Wilhelm die from EX2. As if the valley is physically manifesting Wilhelm's inner buried guilt over Pivot's death, as he gives Pivot the same wound he suffered in real life. He congratulates Wilhelm, saying he has survived once again, that this is twice you have killed a comrade in arms and ended up surviving, slowly dissipating, telling Wilhelm he will be next. Wilhelm shoots up from his deep slumber, with sweat dripping from not just his forehead, but his entire body. Before he has time to really think about what happened, Conwood says Grimm had found something in the fog. They find the refuge that they had been told about, as Wilhelm, Grimm, and Roswell all enter. They find footprints leading to somewhere in the home, noting that Stride had already been here despite needing the crystal to access it. They speculate about whether he has a crystal or is working with someone who does have one, but since Libre is confirmed dead, that only leaves Sphinx and Valga. A familiar voice in the back of Wilhelm's head tells him to come this way, noting a wall in the house is dirty, but why? It's a wall. Not even questioning the voice, he swings his blade at the wall to uncover a large foreboding magic circle, painted on the white wall within. Roswell creates a copy of the circle to study it, heading back to the capital to hear Carol has woken up. Carol and Grimm finally get to reunite in the capital, but shortly after, her legs are unable to hold herself, collapsing to the ground and barely being caught by Grimm. She's clawing at her throat. Wilhelm shouts out that something is wrong until the voice interjects, saying that this isn't about her throat. He notices she can't breathe, as a dark red mark had swelled up on her pale throat, a bruise that took the shape of a palm. Wilhelm says they have to take her to the healing ward, but the voice intervenes again to say it's not a wise choice, as this is not a wound or a disease. Suddenly, the state of emergency vanishes. Carol can breathe again. When Grimm reaches out to her again, the voice demands Wilhelm make him stop, which he does. The closer Grimm gets to Carol, the hand slowly fades back in and chokes Carol. She has been cursed, as they immediately go to find Roswell. She, however, unfortunately, cannot do anything about this, bringing the blame back to Stride. Wilhelm's inner turmoil about having let Stride live only continues to grow, as now he has separated 2 lovers from each other. Carol is taking this all pretty well, however, saying Stride will soon reap what he has sown. The voice in Wilhelm's head is impressed with her growth, to which Wilhelm agrees. Grimm attempts to vocalize an apology to Carol, but she tells him there is no need. It is due to her own lack of skill that she has been cursed, and it could have been worse. Wilhelm or Teresia could have been affected. As she says these reassuring words to Grimm, she reaches out her hand for Grimm to grab, knowing full well the consequences of the curse. Teresia looks towards Wilhelm, asking if he would hate her if she broke their promise. He doesn't say yes or no, but says that she is not the Sword Saint anymore. For some reason, Roswaal also feels strongly about this, telling Teresia she cannot let her behave as the Sword Saint, pointing out she has also examined Teresia's body after examining Carol's. Teresia Van Estrella is pregnant. Wilhelm suffers the stunlock of a century, but it wasn't just Wilhelm that was surprised, confused, and bewildered by the news, but Teresia too has her fingers trembling. The voice in his head once again becomes clear, as Pivot tells Wilhelm he has always been weak in matters which you cannot solve with your sword. Carol is in Roswaal's new tower in the royal castle's grounds, built after the importance of magic was re-evaluated after the Civil War, 3 months after the previous scene, with no new changes in her curse, leaving the final option to be simply capturing Stride. As this goes on, Teresia announces her pregnancy to her parents, who take it about as well as they can. Her mother, Tishua, can tell that something is weighing heavily on Teresia's mind, telling her to not blame herself for what happened to Carol. In stark contrast to Tishua, however, Roswaal tells Carol that the blame solely lies on Wilhelm and Teresia. Carol is off-put by this, asking if this is some sort of test, to which Roswaal affirms. The fact that she no longer gets angry is a sign that she has grown up. Roswaal does point out that it's not down to her restraint that she can't get angry, but that her emotions are fading away, stating they must capture Stride as soon as possible. In an event that seems that Grimm is carrying all the fury in their relationship, he goes on a rampage through a tavern looking for Stride or any hint of him. Wilhelm and Grimm had gone to a town south of Lugunica, as many eyewitnesses had reported seeing him. Stride is operating without a care in the world. Wilhelm and Grimm exit the tavern, as Wilhelm ponders how he, of all people, got the role of telling people to stay calm, until Conwood runs up, telling them that Miklatov has been attacked at his mansion. When they arrive, they see no attackers and Miklatov is safe. Miklatov acts pretty calm, congratulating Wilhelm on the pregnancy. They talk about what kind of child the Sword Saint and Sword Demon would produce, especially if they would inherit the divine protection to become the strongest Sword Saint ever. Wilhelm drops the small talk though, asking Miklatov why he's even here in such a dangerous time, but somebody else interjects, stating it was due to their own carelessness. And it's no one but King Jonas. Wilhelm then quickly pieces together why Stride had attacked the mansion. Jonas says that he had pushed aside care to talk about something important with a certain gentleman, whose identity he will keep secret, and Wilhelm pushes him on what they came to talk about. Jonas informs him they were here to discuss Stride's plan, his aim of the complete destruction of the Covenant with the Dragon. Ironically, the same exact goal Wilhelm would end up backing later on when joining the Cruise Camp. As he says this, we cut to Grimm getting slashed down by Carol, revealing Stride has reached them in the Estrella house, saying something about giving the observers in heaven a good comedy show. Stride steps forward as Grimm collapses in a pool of his own blood, and gives them a bow as if he were atop a theater stage. Teresia asks how cruel can Stride possibly be to others, and he retorts that it's ironic to say as a person who has murdered thousands. Carol has been turned into a puppet by Stride, and uses her to bring her blade to Veltol and Tishua Estrella, as she screams at them to run away, and fresh blood splatters around the Estrella mansion. We cut back to Pictet, the city where Wilhelm and Kurgan had fought previously. The city officials established higher security after that insane fight, and noticed a new conflict brewing between a merchant and a customer. One of the city guards walks up and grabs the customer, utilizing his divine protection of empathy to try and understand where the man is coming from to defuse the situation. But for some strange reason, the ability or gift the guard had had throughout his entire life was not heeding his call. The man turns to face the guard, revealing himself to be Stride Valakia, and calls him a twisted lump of flesh. The guard had never told anyone about his divine protection, as when people learned about them, it tended to cause strife between people who didn't have one, so he never told a soul he had one besides his family. However, Stride knew. Stride calls the man a twisted spawn of the heavens, as thoughts race through his head, as his lifelong companion, known as his divine protection, had seemingly abandoned him, and his arm comes off his shoulder, still clinging onto Stride. Kurgan and a short woman are revealed to be accompanying him. Stride declares his test a success, and looks towards the heavens, telling the audience of fate to watch which choices the world would come to make. By the time Wilhelm had returned to the Estrella mansion, it was over. Teresia had been kidnapped, the 8 soldiers standing guard outside slaughtered, and Veltol Estrella had been killed. Tishua sits on a bed covered in blood, completely unresponsive, until she tells Wilhelm that she has a curse, and is passing on a message from Stride, that he awaits the close with the sword demon in the land of the Silver Flower Dance. Wilhelm immediately puts together that he is in Pictet, and Bordeaux, with no hesitation, works to put together a subjugation force. He promises to her that he will get them all back, and Tishua tells him that he is in Estrella, and to never forget that, something that seemingly does not come to pass in the future. They ride off to Pictet, and Roswaal tells Wilhelm not to blame himself, as Pivot manifests beside him. Pivot and Stride have ended up as Wilhelm's 2 biggest regrets. Roswaal tells him that blaming himself is a big mistake, saying it is conceited to think that he is the only one with a guilty conscience when Carol is out there. Wilhelm tells her that her state is his fault too, and Roswell says men need to stop taking the blame for everything. She adds to forget his humanity and become one where his thoughts are consumed by the enemies he needs to kill, informing Wilhelm that the magic circles used by Stride are being used to disrupt the barrier of the Divine Dragon. Not a literal barrier, but the dragon's alarm. As they talk, a shockwave comes careening down, swallowing up the convoy. Stride pokes fun at Teresia, saying he would never lust for a woman with a stomach so bloated, and informs her that she has been cursed, so that if she acts out, the child inside of her will die. Teresia is not his only prisoner, but many townsfolk are here as well. Teresia attempts to find any commonalities between them, but struggles, as Kurgan enters the room, saying Shasuke and Raizo have returned, as a shinobi clad in jet black clothes rises out of a shadow. They inform Stride that they have got 2 more prisoners, but they must stop piling the burden onto his esteemed wife's eyes, to which Stride rebukes him for. The shinobi taps Stride's shadow as a young-looking girl pops out of it, named Melinda. Stride asks Melinda if her evil eye has reached its limits, and if she couldn't live up to her husband's desires. She anxiously shouts out, no, she isn't finished. He notes that she is lying, and asks if she would rather keep her eyes closed forever, and have them gouged out by his venerable self. Teresia notes that Melinda could be anywhere between the ages of 10 to 19, and with Stride in his 30s, the toxicity of this supposed relationship only becomes more apparent. They have now accumulated 20 sacrifices, and Teresia asks if they really think they can pull this off with just 5 people. He says that if Kurgan is defeated, then so too will his shinobi. Melinda will likely be assaulted, and Stride's head will be taken. Teresia doesn't understand, though. If he assumes that his force will lose, why is he doing it? He replies that avoiding waging battle in the face of inevitable defeat is the normal thing to do, as he pulls out a dagger, saying he still has a chance, stabbing one of the prisoners in the chest. Teresia is shocked, as the divine protection of the Sword Saint didn't register that as an attack, as if it had been taken offline. Stride looks towards the shocked woman, asking if she is going to save them, and for the first time, Teresia glares at someone with murderous intent. Before he continues his massacre, he states that the acting of the sacrifices is a bit too amateurish for him, passing off the blade to the puppet of Carol. Teresia begs him to stop, to not make Carol sully her sword, as she reaps the lives of the remaining 19. He drags everyone out to the rooftop, and Stride points his dagger to the sky and references Teresia's earlier comments about his chances of victory, telling her to feast her eyes. A shadow looms over the rooftop, as its vast wings spread out to the sky with pitch-black steel-like scales, as the 3-headed dragon arrives. The dagger is the dragon's fang, and when you let it drink the blood of the spawn of the heavens, a blood-crazed dragon appears, implying divine protection users have unique blood. He reaches his arm out and uses one of his rings to attempt to turn the dragon into one of his puppets as well, and vocally doubts Teresia's promise to not take up the blade. His venerable self reckons Teresia would break the promise as the transcendental being she is, relying only on her divine protection, so he tells her that he was waiting for this very moment, for her to become pregnant, when she would be too weak to break her vow. What Wilhelm's carriage had been hit by earlier were the flames of the Blight Dragon. The road had been caked in blood and carnage as the Zergev squadron had been demolished, leaving even Roswell at a loss for words. Wilhelm climbs out of the rubble, but freezes upon what he sees in the sky, as a dragon looms above the city. Seeing a dragon is something that only happens every 100 or so years. Some even speculate that the dragon in the sky right now is Volcanica. Wilhelm informs the survivors that he is going in, as Bordeaux shouts to him that they need to review their plans. Grimm catches up to Wilhelm, saying he's not leaving. It's not just those two, but the surviving half of the subjugation force and even Roswell herself join in. She points out that the dragon is not attacking again, meaning it must not be fully controlled by Stride yet. One of the soldiers runs up to Bordeaux and asks to let them fight, to protect their kingdom, their sword saint, their swords, and their pride. He mutters to himself, calling them all dumbasses, as their squadron rushes towards Picton. As they enter the city, they notice the divine protection that Earth dragons have has come undone. Stride is setting out to break the constraints of the world, cutting the link between mankind and the world itself, breaking divine protections and the Dragon Covenant. Breaking the constraints of the world has some interesting implications. Does this mean that if you were inside Stride's magic circle radius, you would be unaffected by things like gluttony? Has he achieved something that Subaru is naturally capable of? Wilhelm doesn't even understand why losing your divine protection is such a big deal, and Roswell equates it to losing the third leg you were born with. Suddenly, they notice someone was rushing towards them. Not one of Stride's men, but someone from the city. It's not just one, as the sounds of footsteps surround them and sound countless. The entire city was heading right towards them. The knights raise their shields as they attempt to hold back the stampede, surviving the initial attack and attempting to push back the horde. Wilhelm thinks about taking their lives before being stopped by Roswell, saying Stride is controlling them and that is exactly what he wants Wilhelm to resort to. Stride is throwing problems at Wilhelm that he cannot solve with a sword, playing to his prime weakness. He puts his sword back in its sheath, using it to knock out swarms of people instead of killing them, but it seems like there's no end to them. Some of the subjugation force begin to cave in and get crushed under the stampede, But it wasn't just that. Wilhelm barely manages to notice a shinobi picking off some of the knights. He engages the shinobi as the subjugation force continues to hold back the swarm of people. The shinobi notes this, throwing a kunai at one of the knights to kill them and weaken the wall, letting more of the mob in. The shinobi also gets caught off guard by an immensely powerful punch from ReZero, as something comes out of Wilhelm's shadow attempting to grab his ankle before being stopped by Grimm, as both Grimm and ReZero get dragged into their own shadows. Wilhelm is stunned, his two comrades disappearing in a matter of seconds, wondering if they're even still alive. Pivot screams out to grab his attention, whipping around to notice Kurgan entering the battlefield, splattering the blood of the mob around the force all over the city. Wilhelm accepts he will have to take on Kurgan, as Bordeaux says he will handle the shinobi. Grimm and ReZero rise up next to Stride, who was annoyed his subordinates couldn't get him the right person. ReZero tells Stride that the Empire will pay for this should he lose, and he doesn't care. ReZero asks what his motivation is then if he's not aligned with the Empire. A shinobi rises up from Stride's shadow, as Stride comments that his oath to that criminal is completed. He tells the shinobi to dispatch the two in front of him, taking special interest in Grimm. Carol is forced up, and he begins to poke fun at Carol and Grimm's relationship. ReZero throws a chunk of stone at Stride, but it is simply blocked by the shinobi. Carol apologizes to Grimm, but Grimm only responds with a broken "I love you," and so begins the fierce battle between the two lovers. Teresia talks with Melinda, asking her if she is from the Evil Eye tribe, to which she confirms, stating that she was the last survivor saved by Stride. She doesn't mind being used by Stride, saying there are countless unhappy marriages, viewing Stride as someone who wants her for who she is. She views him as the pariah who was abandoned by his homeland, the savior of outcasts, and the absolute blow to the observers. When Melinda warns Teresia not to move because of the curse, Teresia states that Stride isn't here, so she'll take the bet. Melinda, outraged, asks if she wants her child to suffer, to which she replies that her child will always suffer as an Estrella. She tells Teresia that she disgusts her, and opens her eyes, reflecting Teresia in the pitch blackness that is her eyes. As soon as she looks at her, she felt a horrible feeling, like her soul was being swallowed and that she was falling down endlessly. She calls out to Wilhelm as she collapses to the ground. Stride speaks to the sky once more, calling out that the testament of the realm is fading away, that the light coming from their divine protections does not seep through, and asks for the cruel observers to witness the choices the world shall make. He watches Carol vs. Grimm with much amusement, noting Carol is fighting with less power, as if she is somehow resisting against the curse. He utilizes a technique that manipulates the body for the puppet to draw out the very limits of its potential, which could destroy the body. When Carol is about to request Grimm kill her, he drops his shield, catching her blade with his bare hands. He then leaps over Carol, looking at Stride, whose face contorts with delight, as a smile shows itself across his face due to this unexpected find. He says, "Surely you must be the one, the ordinary man my venerable self sought for, rather than the sword demon," and calls back the shinobi so that he may skewer both Grimm and Carol at once, only to instead be intercepted by Roswell J. Mathers. Teresia floats through darkness, apologizing to the unborn child inside of her. The world she now exists in slowly manifests around her, showing her her sin, as she looks on upon a swarm of dead. They attempt to crawl their way up to the tower she sits on, and the condemnation of the Sword Saint was about to begin. Back to Wilhelm, Pivot materializes before him, telling him that he is not the real Pivot, but a recreation of the man he knew, a dredge of his sin that clings to the back of his heart, pointing out the harshness of the situation in front of him, as Kurgan informs Wilhelm he is entranced by the Evil Eye. He tells him that those who succumb to the effects of the Evil Eye are those who are weak of mind. Wilhelm decides to try and take Roswell's advice from earlier, clearing his mind of any and all distractions, focusing solely on the sword. Kurgan's eyes light up in anticipation as Bordeaux intervenes in the fight, stating it took him ages to bring Wilhelm back from the path of the beast, and he will not let Kurgan take him back. Pivot says that next it is Wilhelm's turn. Next shall be when he puts his life on the line for what matters to him, like Pivot had done, as Bordeaux trades blows with Kurgan. The shinobi appears, attempting to backstab Bordeaux, but Wilhelm jumps in and slashes off his arm and shatters his sword. When the shinobi is about to fall, he attempts to trigger an explosion hex on his chest, but Bordeaux tanks the bomb for Wilhelm. Bordeaux barely survives the encounter, and Wilhelm tells Kurgan this can now be settled without any distractions. Roswell did not plan on dying here, yet she had ended up like this. She had once again let connection cloud her true goals, but she's still glad she could protect Carol. Grimm finally sees an opening against Stride, kicking his great shield directly at him, but it is futile, as Stride calls down a crimson sword from the sky, the Yang Sword, something we see Priscilla in possession of in Arc 5. He blocks the shield, but his arm immediately bursts into flames, making him let go of the sword and having it ascend back into the heavens. The shinobi throws a kunai for Stride, grabbing it and cutting off his own arm to end the flames. The rings on his now burnt arm begin to crumble to dust, meaning the curses of those fingers start to fizzle out. Carol is finally free from the possession, as Roswell bleeds out on the rooftop. She asks Carol to inform Clind that she entrusts Carl, her son, to him. As Carol shouts out Roswell's true name of Julia, Roswell's last words are, "Find happiness with Grimm," as she succumbs to her wounds on the rooftop. This is an event that seems to even confuse Stride, as he simply mutters, "She died?" under his breath, not a voice of scorn or sarcasm, but rather another unfathomable feeling. Carol will never forgive Stride, but he raises his other arm and tells her to fear not. Even his venerable self does not have enough entrails remaining to pay the price. The rings cause everlasting damage to a part of his body. Even without them, he is forcing himself to keep moving his corpse-like body, a body that he had been bestowed with after he was served poison by his father, the Emperor. He does not seek revenge, though. He is not here for the right to rule. No. What he detests is the construction. This world is merely the cruel observer's miniature garden. Fixed events, pages of a script, fate that has already been decided. The life they live each day is no more than a mere puppet show. The observers cast their roles in their miniature garden, namely by giving people divine protections, and the small fry differ from the observer's pawns. As he says these words, he reaches into his pocket and pulls out none other than a gospel.
I don't mind even a minor roll. Scratches can be made upon the surface of the board, regardless of whether a minor roll is curtailed by the script. The stage can be broken. I shall teach them that.
Stride Valakia is the Sin Archbishop representing pride, a sin due to acting against God, or in this case, acting against the observers, believing oneself more important than divine rule. With Stride's goal finally understood, there is a massive amount to say about Stride. Stride himself could be argued to be seen as the logical conclusion of Wilhelm's past self. Prideful, openly rude, and rejecting connection. One could also argue that Stride's curses are meant to mirror Teresia's initial divine protection of the Death God, an unholy curse that can be afflicted upon people permanently, however, one he inflicts with joy. The parallels with Wilhelm grow even deeper when you consider that Stride has created a zone in the nation where the pact with the Divine Dragon has been nullified, something Wilhelm now fights for being in the Cruise camp. The elephant in the room is, what are the observers? Stride links them to divine protections in some way, as if you have been gifted by the observers to act out roles in the construction. It is an in-universe rumor that Ode Laguna, a mass conduit of mana in the center of the world, is responsible for handing out those divine protections, a consciousness that rules everything in the world. Roswell at the very end of Arc 4 tells Subaru that certain forbidden things may anger Ode Laguna, including his return by death ability, as if his ability breaks the stage. Is Ode Laguna itself an observer? Or is it simply a tool utilized by them? The first theory I came up with when reading Ballad is that, since stars have relevance to the ReZero world, and Stride speaks towards the sky when referring to the observers, what if we take it literally, and he speaks with the stars of the ReZero world? Stride often speaks as if he is performing on a stage, and a star is a term often used when referencing actors. The second theory is that the observers are meant to be a meta-reference like Vivek in the Elder Scrolls, somebody who knows they are in a piece of fiction. While that is one interpretation, it's not something I'm particularly fond of. The final theory is, perhaps the theories that ReZero is one big time loop are potentially true? Not in the way you might think, but rather than directly repeating lives and characters, instead the observers have cast roles. Something like the Sage, something like the Witch, all pieces that move towards a particular conclusion. The Sage doesn't have to be Flugel though, but somebody who could just fill that role that Flugel would play. This theory is not 100% dependent on a time loop though, and the observers could simply be casting roles to fulfill destined fate that doesn't lead to a loop necessarily. The evidence of this is the existence of the Gospels to begin with, as if they were following a thread of fate. Stride seemed confused when Roswell died in front of him, as if it wasn't part of the play curtailed by the script. Stride may not have broken the time loop, but Subaru could have. Subaru multiple times has been able to circumvent established fate, as if he was the first to break his character role. Al also in Arc 3 remarks his annoyance that Ram is alive, as if her death was something that was supposed to come to pass. Would this make Al an observer? It all kind of comes back to, what is an observer? Are isekai people supposed to be observers? Al, Flugel, Hoshin, with Subaru being the main standout? The only implication we have of an observer is Volcanica, something we will get to later. The concept of predetermined fate and observers is something insanely interesting, and I enjoy the possibility of the spin of ReZero being one big time loop, but Subaru is destroying it. It's also important to note that Stride is the only Sin Archbishop we know of currently that lacks any star-related name, further entrenching him in being in existence solely designed to attempt to break free from the construction. But let's get back to the story. Stride refuses to revere the Witch of Envy, saying perhaps, though, she is on the same side as himself, further fueling the idea that Subaru was brought to destroy the Observer's garden. Carol decides that just this once she will act in her own best interest, vowing to murder Stride. He is quite amused by this, calling her an ordinary woman and turning to Grimm, asking him if he has nothing to say. He calls him a madman simply passing by, and Stride says that is the best answer. As Carol and Grimm move to kill Stride, the dragon blows flames down on those on the rooftop. Teresia attempts to flee from the undead and the manifestation of sin, wondering if she still had her divine protection, would she kill them again? She gets grabbed by the undead, unable to shake them off. She hopes that, even if she is torn to pieces, her child is safe, as she calls out to her father, who responds. It's not just Veltol, but her brothers also come to save her. Velto tells Teresi his regrets, that he won't be able to hold his first grandchild, or be there for Carol's wedding, or make his next anniversary for Tishua something spectacular. But you can't live without having some regrets. Freibel, the previous Sword Saint, also appears, swallowing his pride. Teresia had held resentment for the man that she felt had burdened her with such a horrible fate, as Veltol tells her to live and not hold those burdens. She tells him that she always wanted him to name her child. As she returns to the real world, Melinda's evil eye defeated, returning all the townspeople to normal. Teresia tells Melinda that she has no divine protections, and that right here, right now, she is just an ordinary woman. She avoids Teresia's gaze, trembling before pushing her out of the way of the dragon's immense flames. Shasuke grabs Stride, leaping into the sky as the dragon breathes fire down on them, melting even the stone. Suddenly, Carol also leaps up, slashing open his left shoulder. Grim had also survived and held tightly onto Roswell's body. Carol yells out that she is a sheath, and Grim is a shield, and they shall remain companions of their sword, as the fight ends up on the Black Dragon's back. As the battle of Carol and Shasuke begins, Carol deals with him quite easily, as Stride jumps off the dragon. Melinda had pushed Teresia away and shut the door, left alone to mercilessly burn in that room. She begged Melinda to open the door, as all she could hear were screams of agony. She refuses, telling her the child in her room bears no sin. The door finally opens, as Teresia watches Melinda jump off the balcony to reach Stride in the sky, both being swallowed by the dragon. Carol, Grim, and Teresia finally reunite as Wilhelm continues fighting in the city. Kurgan points out that the evil eye has come undone, and that the fight here isn't quite over yet, as Wilhelm and Kurgan continued on. Wilhelm asks why Kurgan stands with Stride, and Kurgan tells him he is essentially his adoptive father. Kurgan tells Wilhelm he hopes he does not repeat his same parenting mistakes. The Emperor of Wallachia marries a great number of wives and has a great number of children, so that those children compete to kill each other to earn the title of Emperor. Such is the way of Wallachia. Stride was born weak and frail, leading his family to believe him succeeding was impossible. His inheritance was renounced, and he was exchanged. Bearing the name Eight Arms, Kurgan had been granted an elevated position as the Empire's unparalleled hero. Kurgan took in Stride, and his heart throbbed in excitement at the bottomless darkness lodged in the eyes of the child. As Stride became an adult in accordance with his duty as a successor, he took care of the siblings he shared blood with by utilizing various schemes. Stride, however, had one big issue. Ever since he had a high fever one day, he had lost the ability to make children, making him unfit to be emperor. In response, Stride's father had attempted to poison the child to solve this problem, but during the illness, he saw the truth. He saw the way of the observers, seated in the heavens, looking down upon them with scorn. Stride was more frail than ever, but even if no one could, Kurgan would love his lonely, foolish son, who was unable to love others. Wilhelm finally overcomes Kurgan, who says that he has now placed his foot down on the steps of the Heavenly Sword. Wilhelm, however, responds saying he has no idea what he is talking about. Kurgan only mutters, "Magnificent," as he crumbles to the ground. No one had ever recorded anything about encountering a dragon other than Volcanica. Whoever this black dragon was could be a history-redefining being. High up in the sky, a silver gleam swooped up and pierced the dragon's black wings. As Wilhelm began to fight the dragon, Grim runs to Wilhelm, telling him to hold on, as Wilhelm literally fights for his life. Wilhelm notes that no dragon should fight this way, acting as if it's an amateur. This is no dragon anymore. This is the last essence of Stride Walachia's being. Teresia steps out, using her status as the Sword Saint to inspire everyone to fight against the dragon. Dragon charges its breath, but Wilhelm stabs his sword through the bottom of one of its mouths, stopping it from releasing its fire. From the other head, he takes Grim's shield and slams it down its maw, making it so the fire explodes in its own throat. For the final head, he grabbed its mouth that had been slashed and twisted it around so that it released its fire at its own wings. Wilhelm plummets to the ground as Bordeaux catches him. Wilhelm, however, knows the fight isn't over yet, and as he gets back up, Bordeaux stops him. His Majesty has stirred. Wilhelm first thinks of the king, but then he looks up. What he instead sees is a dragon. Not the same dragon he had been fighting though, but the divine dragon Volcanica. Compared to Volcanica, the once large black dragon now seems pitiful in comparison. Volcanica refers to it as Valgren, calling it a pitiful child. The sky twisted and turned, as the flames all around them were cleansed in an instant, alongside healing all of Wilhelm's wounds. Volcanica opens his mouth, letting loose a white beam at Valgren that destroys him and only him, completely protecting the surroundings. Valgren, which had caused so much destruction, was turned to dust in mere seconds. The city begins to celebrate their victory, as the subjugation of the Blight Dragon comes to a close, and Stride Walachia's nightmare ends. It was raining on the day the funeral was held, 10 days after the subjugation had succeeded. They have gathered here today to celebrate the life of Roswell J. Mathers. A young child walks up to Wilhelm, and says his mother told him a lot about him. It's Julia's child, Carl, who will grow to be known as Roswell K. Mathers. He gives the boy a knight's bow, thanking Julia for everything she had done for him, and letting Carl know he is at his service. They get to talking, and Wilhelm seems shocked by Carl's maturity, feeling like he is in fact speaking word for word to Julia herself. Carl says he is still dependent on his butler Clind, but one day, he will bear the responsibilities of the Mathers house. Carol tells Carl that his mother died for her and apologizes, but Carl simply tells her that Mom would be delighted from the bottom of her heart that she was safe. Carol begins to refer to Wilhelm as Sir. As with Veltol dead and Teresia having no siblings, the title for head of the Estrella household falls onto Wilhelm. Miklatov takes a seat in a rusty iron guest room with a giant, stating that Gionis had entrusted the giant to him. He asks why the giant helped them out despite hating humans, and the giant affirms his hatred, but feared more that his brethren would have died as well. Miklatov asks if the man has any discomforts, and he responds with just a laugh, rattling his chains. He was born with discomfort, and one day he will realize just who ought to be chained. The giant known as Valga Cromwell, or Old Man Rom, survived to tell the tale. Wilhelm and Kurgan are together as he is being escorted, bound and chained. He asks him why he doesn't seem upset that his son has passed on, and Kurgan says that in his final moments, his son fulfilled his long-cherished desire to challenge an observer. He called a dragon. Not a blight dragon, but a real dragon, twisting the fabric of reality, as Wilhelm turns Kurgan over to the Vlakian Empire. Since the Empire doesn't recognize Stride, all of the blame is likely to fall to Kurgan. Bordeaux announces he plans to hang up his axe and move more to politics, and Grimm tells Wilhelm he plans to marry Carol, planning to also quit the Knight's Order. The entirety of the squadron was invited to the Royal Guard, and Wilhelm was asked to be its commander. Teresia and Wilhelm discuss Carol and Grimm's soon-to-be marriage. Well, it's mostly Teresia, as Wilhelm sits with his eyes closed, trying to listen to the sound of his child. Teresia says he still wishes Veltol got to name their child, jogging Wilhelm's memory and pulling out a letter from Tishua, containing a list of names, many marked off, considered and rejected, or signs of excitement around them, but only one amongst them, just one. The last one remaining had a circle around it. Heinkel Estrella. Teresia tells Wilhelm she loves him, and asks, "What about you?" He says, "You know that," still not saying those 3 words. Battle Ballad was something unbelievably special. Easily the best ReZero side story, which is funny considering it comes off the heels of, in my opinion, the weakest. Battle Ballad takes all of the flaws of EX3 and completely and utterly fixes them. Every character feels like themselves again, and every interaction feels greatly important. In EX3's best aspect, Stride dominates the book. Amazing character work for everyone involved, even bringing back a character I disliked, Veltol, and turning him into someone of worth. Wilhelm's progression comes to a climax in Battle Ballad, completely regaining the lost points from his dreadful display of EX2. EX2 and 3 have their issues, and honestly, before reading Battle Ballad, I might have recommended holding out on reading these yourself, but Battle Ballad makes it all worth it. It is genuinely an amazing story that requires the context of the prior books. Thank you so much for watching. If you like this video, please remember to like, comment, and subscribe for the funny YouTube algorithm. You can check the description down below to follow me on Twitter, where I'm objectively correct all the time. You can also join my Discord, where we talk about My Hero Academia, ReZero, Jujutsu Kaisen, and stuff like that. And you can also now become a YouTube member, which basically just gives you access to behind-the-scenes content, a little badge on comments, and live stream chats, and access to some emotes. Only do so if you want to support the channel, though. But that's about it, though. Thank you for watching. See ya.